colleagues, welcome. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you that are joining us. We're going to give it another minute as the room fills up. These days, I try to imagine that we were in a real room and you were coming in with coffee, you just got off the subway, the bus was late, I don't know, something happened and we were all sort of talking among ourselves and getting settled in the room. So that's what I'm trying to imagine, though I can't see all of you right now. What would be great as you're coming in, if you want to just send us a little note in the chat of where you're calling in from today, and then we can imagine that as well too. So thank you all. We'll just give it one more minute. So colleagues, I'll get rolling, just because I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and an hour is never enough time, and we also want to be sure that we have enough time for discussion with all of you. So welcome. These are UNDP's development dialogues. We are really happy to have you all here with us today, and a really fantastic set of panelists to talk about an important topic. And this is a topic that's backed by popular demand, which we are also very happy about, based on an earlier development dialogue that we had about the use of data and analytics in fragile settings towards recovery. And I think really reimagining what that means to us, especially in light of COVID, where we see disruptions at such a fast moving pace and really with a global scale that's unprecedented. So that's also an opportunity for us to rethink a little bit how we use data and analytics, and how this is applied in a fast changing, in a very dynamic space and environment that we live in. So the idea for the discussion today is to go a little bit further than we did in the first development dialogue on this topic. We want to talk about, investigate, question, raise some concerns around different uses of data and the way that data is informing new technologies. And from two perspectives: one, from the perspective, how can that support our work? How can that support pathways out of fragility? How can that support recovery, peace building, and social cohesion? And within that, how can we use data more creatively? Something we're also really excited about and doing a lot of work on in UNDP, to triangulate data, to create simulations, to use different types of information where we know we have significant data gaps, etc. So how can we do more with what we have? How can we be more creative in thinking through applications? And the other side of it, a question I'll be sort of pressing all of our panelists about, is how do we get these technologies in the hands of communities and of decision makers so that this actually hits the road and impacts the way that we're working, impacts the results? Some of the things that we find, we have some fantastic tools and technologies at UNDP, but the application is key. Decision makers feeling comfortable, feeling that they understand this enough. They feel a strong enough sense of ownership or accountability. What does it look like in practice? So we're going to be looking at the opportunities, we're going to be looking at the practice, and the other thing that we're going to be looking at today is some of the challenges, some of the unintended consequences, or some of the consequences that we see and we're emerging, and that we need to be aware of in terms of the way that we're using data, the way that we are ensuring an accountability to communities, that we're protecting privacy, security, that we're using data in a way that is enhancing good governance practices and not detracting from it. So this isn't a conversation only about blue skies and opportunities, but also what are some of the potential pitfalls here that we need to be aware of. So I'm looking forward. It'll be a great discussion today. And I'm going to start by introducing our first panelist, who is Harsh Desai. Harsh is joining us from the OECD. He's a fragility policy analyst there, and he'll be talking to us about data modeling, one of our favorite topics, no matter what, to help us measure, understand, and address fragility. So Harsh, over to you, and welcome again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laurel, and thank you to the audience, colleagues at UNDP, and the panelists for the opportunity to present this work. So I'll spend the next 5 or so minutes reflecting on how the OECD uses data to understand and measure fragility, and how this data provides an evidence-based foundation for OECD members' work in fragile contexts. So to start off, before getting into some of the more technical details, just wanted to clarify what I mean when I talk about fragility. There are 2 important components to this definition in terms of the OECD's work. So the first is that fragility is a combination of exposure to risk and insufficient coping capacities to counteract those risks. Risks manifest themselves differently, as we all know, at different times and different scales, with some of them happening suddenly and others building up over a long time. So it's important to measure and analyze how those risks are manifesting. At the other end, though, the other part of the equation, you have coping capacities, what we call resilience, that provide entry points to counteract some of these risks. So fragility is a dynamic balancing act between various risks and coping capacities. The second component to this definition is that fragility is multidimensional, happening in a spectrum of intensity across 5 dimensions: the economic, environmental, political, security, and societal. And with our upcoming work, we'll introduce a 6th dimension measuring human capital outcomes. So that really provides a definitional basis to understand fragility. And now I'll talk about how we actually go about measuring it through data. So as you can see here, we take about 3 steps to measure risks and coping capacities to fragility in each dimension. In the first step, we collect data for about 45 indicators across all 5 dimensions, or about 8 to 12 indicators in each dimension. These indicators measure either a risk or a coping capacity using data sourced from various institutions, such as the usual suspects like the World Bank, the IMF, the UNDP, and also other academic institutions. Because we're trying to understand the state of fragility globally, we use data sets that cover as many countries as possible and that are updated regularly and provide a time series, preferably an annual update. Next, in the second stage, we synthesize these indicators using a statistical methodology called principal components analysis, or PCA. Without getting into the technical details and risking everyone's eyes glazing over, this method is a way at getting at from a lot of indicators in each dimension into 1 or 2 composite scores. These scores exist for each dimension and are used to find countries that have similar fragilities in a given dimension, which is essentially what we call our clustering approach to understand commonalities and patterns within different dimensions. So then once we've done that, we run a second stage of principal component analysis with the dimensional scores to arrive at overall fragility scores, which we use to create what we call the fragility framework. So this essentially, this diagram here is essentially the fragility framework. It's updated every 2 years, coinciding with the launch of our States of Fragility report series. So as many of you may know, in States of Fragility 2020, which we published in September of last year, we identified 57 fragile contexts, with 13 being extremely fragile. These 57 fragile contexts are the contexts most left behind from sustainable development progress. As you can see, in 2020, they accounted for about 1/4 of the world's population, but 3/4 of the world's extreme poor. And from our most recent data analysis, they account for only 2% of the world's population that have received COVID-19 vaccinations. So there's clear inequalities there. So since this is a panel about data innovations, I'll talk a little bit about kind of the innovations and different methodologies that we have coming up. So thus far, we have measured fragility at the level of the nation state, which is typical of most fragility measures. But we are looking at measures of fragility at other levels, at other geographic levels. For example, if you followed the other development dialogues, then you know that risks manifest themselves at different levels, such as regionally, sub-regionally, and subnationally. Sorry. So it's important to understand how these different levels manifest and how they affect each other, because again, fragility is sort of a dynamic process. So I won't run through the technical details. You can ask me in Q&A, but moving forward, we're looking to unpack different layers of fragility and leverage data to systematically analyze these levels. And I look forward to the other panelists' interventions for some ideas about how that could potentially happen. So to conclude, I'll end with a reflection on how the framework is being used. So it's important to say that the framework is not a programmatic or an operational tool. It has informed high-level strategic planning in various organizations that work in fragile contexts. It has also informed country-level analyses and exercises, such as the ones that I highlight on this slide. Our team is looking into these different applications to produce dynamic, multidimensional snapshots of fragility at the country level to inform high-level decision-making. And I encourage you all to go to the OECD's States of Fragility data platform to see some of this in action. At the end of the day, the fragility framework is one of many data tools to measure and analyze fragility. It is one piece of a broader data puzzle. And in today's session, I really look forward to hearing from the other panelists about the other puzzle pieces and how they may work together to form a comprehensive and complementary data ecosystem in fragile contexts. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to your questions. And thanks again very much for listening to this presentation. Over to you.
Harsh, fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful way of opening and bringing us into this conversation. And I think this notion of a puzzle is equally fantastic. And this is really what we're trying to, it's a good way of thinking about the challenges of fragility, complex challenges in general. And let's add more to the board. So I'm really happy to welcome and introduce Declan Otaro. Declan is the Chief Operating Officer at Ushahidi. And those of you who are not familiar with this organization, Ushahidi means testimony in Swahili. Declan, I spent a good 10 or 12 years in Kenya, so I know the great work of your organization. And this is an organization that was actually developed to help map reports of violence in 2008, post-election violence, and has continued to really be a voice of and for the people and harnessing new technology as a social enterprise to that end. So Declan, we are really delighted to have you and hear a little bit from you about how you think that local data collection can support early warning and also, I think, ensure that that voice and accountability to the people is maintained. So Declan, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurel. And hello, everyone from different parts of the world. I'm pleased to be speaking to you today. And thank you for the folks at UNDP for inviting me. And thank you for that introduction, Laurel. You've spared me having to share, repeat some of the detail about our organization. But I'll still go through a brief overview of who we are. So next slide, please. So like you rightly say, Ushahidi is a Swahili word. The next slide. All right, I'll just proceed. I think it's still taking some time to show up, right? It's a Swahili word that means testimony, and our roots are in a fragile time in our country, in Kenya. That is the post-election violence in 2008 after the disputed general election. So what happened was it was very difficult to get an accurate picture of what was happening in the ground. There was a lot of misinformation being spread, and at the same time, information being blocked from vital information that was required from being distributed. So what our co-founders did is create this platform to enable citizens from wherever they were to share their first-hand experiences of what they were witnessing wherever they were, by text, email, SMS, and web. So the platform enabled the ordinary citizens to document these experiences and then share this information and allow appropriate action to be taken. I'm on slide 3. So we're a global nonprofit technology company headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya, where I am based. And we develop integrated tools and services to enable people to generate solutions and mobilize communities for good. We build our open source software, which also goes by the same name, Ushahidi, with the intent of strengthening communities and improving lives, empowering users to rapidly and purposefully gather, analyze, respond, and act on data and information. We also build marginalized, the next slide, Flo. We build capacity in marginalized communities to leverage technology for social change through training, strategic support, and facilitating collaborations with communities of and since our founding in 2008, next slide, please. Our crowdsourcing tools have been used by thousands of groups and millions of people to raise voices, inform decisions, stop suffering, and influence change. Some of Ushahidi's use cases include advancing democracy, reporting incidents, mobilizing crisis response, simplifying research, encouraging act.
I think we have a challenge here, colleague, with the technology.
Sorry, did it?
Ah, there, you're back. Declan, we lost you. We lost you for a minute.
Sorry about that. You can see how we still have to grapple with technology challenges
Absolutely.
across the world. This is something that continues to happen. But glad to be back. I hope I didn't miss out too much of what I was saying. If I happen to be disconnected, I will switch channels, but I will watch out for that. So I was on slide number 6. Just talking about now how we perceive the role of local data collection from experience. And we're now a teenage organization, so we've had the opportunity to see the implementation of the Ushahidi platform in over 200,000 different contexts around the world. And from what we've seen, what was true then when we started out, still true now, that local level data continues to be really important. And why is this so? It enables you to get an accurate picture of what is happening on the ground. This is something which hasn't been moderated. It is the voice of the people who are sharing their lived experiences. And so even as we're thinking about fragility contexts, we're not moderating people's opinions, views. We are hearing straight from them about what is their lived experiences. And this can also be aggregated together so that we can get a much broader view of what is happening from what is happening on the ground. Also involving the people on the ground eliminates data blind spots. We have people talking about what they're seeing. So you're much less likely to miss out on important data, important information if you're involving the people who are living this on a day-to-day basis and sharing the experiences. And another advantage, you can get information in near real time. This is especially important when decisions are hinged on being able to get information early in order to act. So for example, in terms of crisis, when a decision made now can have a much bigger effect down the line, getting access to information as quickly as possible will significantly help with that. And finally, it gives agency to the local people as they feel involved as part of the solution. We're not just going top down, but involving them in things that involve their lives, and avoiding some of the mistakes that we've made in the past, where we're making policy pronouncements without incorporating their voices, and hence citizens feeling disconnected. To demonstrate this, I have one example. Next slide, please. That was taken from Kenya. And this is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to have widespread effects, not only in Kenya, but in many other countries. So this particular deployment was set up to help livestock farmers. So at the onset of the pandemic, governments were taking various actions to either limit the spread of the pandemic, for example, imposing lockdowns, or offering some sort of social reliefs. But some of these were not trickling down to the smallhold farmers. So there's a group, an organization that is called the Green Dreams Technology that decided to do something about this. They saw the potential of livestock farmers, the effects that they were suffering, leading to food security problems down the line. So what they did was set up an Ushahidi platform coupled with a toll-free telephone line to collect and document farmers' experiences and connect them to critical services that they needed. And these were ranging from extension services, maybe connecting them with veterinary officers, documenting the challenges that they experienced with the lockdowns or access to markets, amongst other things. As a result, they're able to gather data, analyze, and share results with their various parties in near real time for action. Next slide. And this is just one example, but you can see when I was looking at some of the indicators, some of the places that this could also be relevant when looking at fragility indicators. For example, I'll just pick on one that is quite relevant when looking at political contexts and access to medicine, and now very specifically access to vaccines. This is the challenge that we are looking at currently, and I know there are many organizations and many people who are also doing this as well. This being distributed equitably? Do the people who actually need these COVID vaccines getting access to these vaccines, and what does it mean in terms of fragility for the nations affected? So in closing, next slide. Our main goal is to ensure ordinary citizens are included and can influence decisions that are being made about them. And I'll continue the analogy of farming. The seeds that, like we have in the farm, is the data that we collect, and the maps that we use. This is an essential ingredient in producing output. Our platforms, data platforms such as ours, and there are many others, are fertile lines. They make the data accessible and ingestible. But without the people on the ground, the farmers, we cannot yield any produce. So we need to make sure that local communities are included in the decision-making processes, as they're the ones who are most directly affected and have a very clear understanding of what is happening on the ground in their particular context. It is imperative for that citizen engagement and participation is always prioritized. I will stop there, but I look forward to engaging with other panelists and attendees for this particular conference, and answering any questions after this. Thank you very much.
Declan, thank you so much. Fantastic. And thank you for contributing to the puzzle and the picture that we're trying to create together. Thanks for bringing in this perspective of people, a voice of lived experience, a little bit of challenge on blind spots and what we know and what we don't know, and how that impacts both the way that policies are made, the way that action takes shape, but especially this point that you've made at the end as well too, which I think would be interesting to discuss with the other panelists, which is around equitable distribution across a number of fronts of resources, as you've mentioned, a vaccine, of different issues and so on, and how can we use technology to start to shine a spotlight on that, right? And give voice as well too. So thank you. And it's a perfect segue into our next panelist, who is Melissa Persaud. Melissa is the Director of Growth at Frame. Frame is a wonderful partner of UNDP's and many others. Frame, for those of you who are less familiar, and Melissa, I'm sure you'll have better ways of saying this, but the best way to describe Frame, I think, is as geospatial pioneers, which I also just think happens to be a very cool way of describing someone. But a really fantastic and interesting organization that's helping us to have impact in areas where data is difficult to get hold of. And it's really important for us to understand population characteristics, for us to understand population behaviors, so that we can target most vulnerable populations, both from the perspective of leaving no one behind, but especially from the perspective of reaching the furthest behind first. So Frame is a key partner of ours in the work we're doing on vaccine equity and supporting countries with hyper-local data insights. With Frame technology, you can zoom in to dynamics, characteristics, and behaviors at the 1 kilometer square level, which is really amazing opportunity for us. And Melissa will tell us a little bit more, and the discussion that she's bringing into our conversation today is around the use of satellite imagery. So Melissa, over to you, welcome.
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you to all the organizers, UNDP, and all of our colleagues for the opportunity to speak today. For our quick discussion, I'm going to use two examples of our work that I think will be relevant and can start to tie in some of the themes that we've been talking about. First, we'll talk a little bit about how we can map different types of vulnerability to climate shocks and population level resilience and adaptive capacity. And then the second, we'll talk a bit about our conflict modeling to better understand community level dynamics when it comes to specific types of conflict. In this case, we'll look at farmer-herder conflict. But with that great introduction, Frame at our core was created to answer the biggest questions on resource allocation, programming, policy making, and even monitoring and evaluation at a subnational level. At the end of the day, we aim to map humanity, and we do that by weaving together the wealth of publicly and semi-publicly available data out there to answer precise questions that are that require subnational information. To do this, we use machine learning, and I can speak a little bit more about that probably during the Q&A. But we're able to take essentially the types of imagery that we are probably familiar with, things like nighttime illumination and household surveys on population characteristics, and move from national level statistics down to 1 square kilometer estimates of what communities look like. In practice, on the climate risk, we have used frameworks like the fragile states framework that Harsh was describing, components of it, research-backed frameworks that allow us to think creatively about how to measure very complex issues and parse out what can be actionable and made local. So in our climate vulnerability index, for example, we looked at themes of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And you'll see a lot of vocabulary that was discussed in the previous sessions because they are the kind of broadest and most comprehensive measures of different types of climate vulnerability. Once we were able to calculate these different subcomponents, you aggregate up to a climate vulnerability index that is a score, essentially, as Harsh mentioned, with a PCA. And we applied this framework in 2 countries, Mali and Malawi, to start to identify the subnational adaptive capacity to climate shocks and overall climate resilience. At the end of the day, what we end up with is a population level understanding. subnationally about how communities are similar or different, and then start to get to the question of what resources can be allocated to these places to respond to the specific drivers of the high or low score. In this case, we zoom into Mali and we can see that now, applying the framework and using frame technology, we can see that there are, and calculate that there are about 14 million people who are highly vulnerable to climate shocks, and zoom in and start to see the spatial differences. So based on the location, how are you similar or different? And then who is most vulnerable, and how quickly do we move from less vulnerable to more? And I think this application of the climate risk model allows us to get a better sense of both on the disaster risk management side or risk reduction side of who can benefit from prevention work, and then who might be most vulnerable when a shock happens in the community. This has been a framework or an approach that we apply to some of our other shock modeling. So Laurel mentioned our work in COVID-19. In the early days, we mapped out different levels of risk that were related to exposure and comorbidities, and also food security. So when governments were locking down certain areas, we were able to unpack exactly who was on the cusp of food insecurity and what they would potentially need in terms of food distribution in an acute way or in a longer term way, and how that was different than where traditional food distribution campaigns were happening in the country. And COVID-19 challenged us in many ways, but one of those is actually thinking about the social support mechanisms that can be deployed and who is most in need. It's not necessarily the same profile as some of our more humanitarian or development work. I'm going to switch over to a interactive platform to talk a little bit about our climate vulnerability. So I'm sorry, conflict vulnerability, which is a different approach. So we're able to weave together our population characteristics here and identify communities that are similar to areas that have faced specific types of conflict. In this case, we're going to look at farmer-herder conflict because of the nature of the relationship with climate shocks and climate vulnerability. So here I'm moving the map down to the square kilometer estimate of population dynamics. And we're able to zoom into communities that share common characteristics to areas that have faced farmer-herder conflict in the past. In this case, rather than household surveys as a training data for our model, we are looking at ACLA data as points of conflict that are classified and categorized, and that we can analyze and input into our model. That then gets woven together with all of the population characteristics, and we're able to start to unpack which communities are facing similar issues. In this case, our model, we took about 18 months of historical data on farmer-herder conflict and then waited 6 months and plotted those against our predictive map. And 90% of the incidents that we had identified, areas that we had identified as high likelihood, did have an incident of farmer-herder conflict. So at that point, we feel quite confident in our ability to identify specific types of vulnerability because of the nature of our database, because of the nature of all the wealth of data that's available. We're able to say there are hundreds of population characteristics that we can look at that can start to unpack the drivers of specific types of conflict. We can pair this data with those individual indicators and turn that into action. So our partners are using this information, plotting points of interest like health facilities or government services, and identifying the specific vulnerabilities in those areas that may require additional investment. Finally, we are also able to start to think about resource allocation. So if a community is highly vulnerable to a specific type of conflict, what are the other issues in the area? How do we communicate with the folks who are in these places? how do I consume information as a community member here in Nigeria? We have this wealth of information at our fingertips where individuals are using mobile phones to access information and or not. And in this case, mobile phone ownership is quite high relative to the higher order administrative unit. And then we can also think about who's not being reached through traditional media messaging, for example, that would be happening through radio or TV. This information plus economic data and educational information allows you to have a much better, more comprehensive picture of how to take action once we identify specific types of vulnerability. So I'll stop there and really looking forward to your questions. But at the end of the day, the piece that I would like everyone to take home is that there are new technologies and approaches that allow us to get very granular with the types of information we can model and then turn that into action where, as many of the presenters have talked about, national statistics, national overviews often mask those issue areas. We often are waiting too long to better understand the community level dynamics before we take action.
Fantastic. Melissa, thank you so much. And I think a lot for colleagues to think about and take in and explore. And we're really excited to work on this with you through our Data Futures platform, which also connects with our crisis risk dashboard, is a really important opportunity for us to be able to get granular, as you say, and really think about behavior characteristics, implications, and early action at a highly localized level. So our final speaker, and then we will open up for a panel discussion, is Emmanuel Letouze. He is the director of the Data POP Alliance. I'm not sure where the POP comes from, Emmanuel, so you're going to have to tell us about the Data POP, the POP and the Data POP. But this is a collaborative lab that many of you may already be familiar with, created by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, by MET, ODI, a whole consortium of researchers and experts in an incredibly dynamic space, thinking about how we understand local realities, how we understand and diagnose human problems, where data and AI can be helpful in that, and also how we enable capacity, something I think that many of us are thinking about so that we are more data literate as sets of institutions together with our partners, and how we take all of this together, how we're using this to drive systems shifts and shaping systems in the communities that we work. So Emmanuel, welcome. Emmanuel will be talking to us about big data and the way that we can use big data effectively, both on the measurement side of understanding fragility and taking action to address it. So Emmanuel, over to you. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the invitation. So coming last is a bit of a blessing and a curse, because a lot of things have been said before, but it's also an opportunity to actually reflect on what's been said. And so to do so, I would like to reflect actually almost on a decade of data revolution or big data revolution. So first I'll talk about some concepts and the context in which those questions are being posed. So whether and how data and big data may help better measure and address fragilities. And then I talk about some of the challenges and obstacles, and then some pathways, like channels moving forward. So in less than 7 minutes now. So first, obviously, if you think about the world 10 years ago, so it was pre-big data revolution. It was the time when there was the Arab Spring. And so at the time I was working a lot on fragility. So I actually worked on the 2012 and 2013 OECD Fragile States report. And at the time we talked about fragile states, and now we talked about states of fragility. And I think that that says a lot about how our conceptualization of fragility has changed, has become more complex, more granular. And at the same time, there was this big data revolution, which sort of also put a premium on complexity. And so with all the big data available, surely we were going to be able to better understand human ecosystems, to predict to forecast, to nowcast, and better measurements, better measurement of the SDGs, and all sorts of indicators. And surely that was going to improve things. And it's the time when also there was a lot of emphasis, growing emphasis since then, on resilience. So the ability of a human system to retain function even in the face of shock and pressure. So the idea of a balloon that can shrink or expand according to the outside pressure. And so obviously you're familiar with this. And so one thing that I think is important is to remember that we should conceptualize big data, if we talk about big data, as not just large data set, but as an ecosystem. So I call it the 3 C's or the 4 C's of big data, where you have the crumbs, so these digital footprints at the heart, but then all around you have the capacities that have been discussed and displayed in the example. So the machine learning, parallel computing, etc. So that these systems these algorithms are able to learn from data. And then you have whole new communities of academics, of researchers, policymakers, of citizens who are also able to make sense of these data. And then I think it creates a data culture. And so there was a lot of expectation. There's a lot of opportunities to better measure and address these different states of fragility. So there are also obstacles, pitfalls. We know some of them: access to data, digital divides, ethical, legal challenges, biases in the data, the decision gap. It's not sufficient to have data about a problem to actually make good decisions, both because we're not rational beings, but also because there's politics and economics involved. And so I think the biggest challenge and biggest pitfall is actually probably, as always, the political one. So the politics, the fact that a lot of the people in power have a very strong incentive, I would say, for the status quo. So we may talk about ESG indicators, etc., but as long as our mindsets and frameworks are driven by or towards profit, for example, or patriarchy, I think very little will actually change. I just want to stress also the fact that one of the biggest risks, I think, is techno-solutionism and a bit of a ethnocentricity that I see a lot in the space of let's say big data for good. So people who are very good in tech and data science, but who don't really understand or don't want to understand the politics. And so I would say last in the last 2.5 minutes that I had, so this sort of so what? And so Laura, you've actually pointed to some of the pathways and some of the principles. I think in terms of principles, dials, principles for digital development are actually a good starting point. So the emphasis on co-creation, on sustainability, on empowerment, and those concepts have been stressed by the panelists. I would also add a 10th one, because there are 10 principles, that I think it has to be more normative. I mean, we need to state what is the kind of world that we want. And you can say co-creation, empowerment, etc. But if we're not ready to really change and challenge existing power structures and the role of profit, for example, then I think little is actually going to change. In terms of priorities, what we do with data pop. So pop comes from population. I'm a demographer by training, but it also comes from pop art, also because I do cartooning, and so I've always liked so I thought it was a nice reference to both population and to pop art, and sort of explosion of data. So I think the key for me is to both dataify democracy. So meaning having better measures, more efficient systems, more reasoned discussions and decisions. So dataify democracy, but also democratize data. And we've talked about, so it means both distributing data, giving more control to people over their data, and trying to break down some silos, some elite capture that's been happening, and that the data revolution can actually increase. And so in conclusion, I would say that, and we try to do that in our projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, the MENA region in particular. And so in conclusion, when I'm asked like what are the ways in which big data and data can actually change, build like more like resilient societies, I say first that it's not just about building resilient societies, it's also about building fairer societies. And so this balloon analogy, like maybe if the pressure kept like changing so much, like the balloon wouldn't have to change, like to adapt all the time, because it's quite tiring to adapt like to changes in pressure. So maybe we want, you know, a fairer, like more predictable, a smoother kind of world. And so last word, I see three roles for data. One is as a lens, so to see the world better and differently. Second, as a language, I think data is going to be or should be the language of the 21st century. Our discussions should be based on fact, but also on the kind of trust and respect that are required to have discussions between people. And thirdly and lastly, as a lever of change, so as a tool that should be put in the hands of the majority and not a small minority, as I fear it might be the case with growing digitalization. Thank you.
Fantastic, Emmanuel. Thank you so much. And I think that it's a perfect way of capping off the individual presentations and moving into the discussion. So I would ask if all of the panelists can put their cameras on. There's a number of questions that have been asked in the Q&A. I'm going to combine a couple and throw them back at all of you while the participants that are listening in are thinking and adding more questions that you'd like to have answered. So I want to pick up two questions. One comes from Tushar and one comes from Sarah Rattray, and they're both asking questions about implicit bias. Declan, it came to you directly from Tushar, but it's across the board for all of you. And Emmanuel, you've really highlighted some of these issues and challenges. So how in the work that you're doing on data, how are you managing challenges or countering these risks of different biases? And how are you ensuring in the way that data is being collected that they're countering for misinformation? Which I think is also key, especially Declan, in the context in which you've been talking about, which are rapidly evolving situations that are involving a level of crisis and instability. So could I put that back to the panelists? Declan, maybe starting with you and others that might want to come in on that.
Thank you for that question. And this is a question that we do get a lot. And maybe something I should also mention with that over 200,000 different deployments that OECD has been used for. We're only involved as an organization in a small number of them. A lot of these are deployers in their own communities, deploying the software and maybe only referencing us for support. So some of the things that we try to do is share some of the experiences that we have that would counter some of those challenges, from the design of how they structure the say the surveys that they use to collect information, what's the things that they're looking for instance, what to look out for, the pitfalls and so on, and various ways to check the information that is being submitted. One thing that we have observed time and again, when a lot of the time when you have large data sets, a lot of different diverse people contributing to a deployment, and that is one of the key success measures. If you're able to get a large group of people submitting information, then you're able to get a lot to balance out some of those opinions, so that if there's, say, a group that is trying to skew data towards a certain end, that could be one way of checking it. But also it's important sometimes to combine the online measures with offline as well. Sometimes it needs to, the data needs to go through some further checks. And that's where networks are really important, or organizations that are really connected to the community are very important, so that they can also collaborate. If there's things that they need to check, they can do that with each other. If they have a way of also getting information that either corroborate what it is that is being submitted, or if information is not absolutely clear, this is something that is verified or not, then that can also be indicated, so that whoever is consuming this data also has that knowledge that this is something that may have been reported but not necessarily verified as yet. So there's various techniques that we use that we also share with our deployers just to help them with that.
Declan, thanks. Would any other panelists like to come in on that question?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the input data is really important. And some of that can be triangulated with other information. So our primary input is household surveys that have been approved, like conducted by a development agency, approved by government, engaged the National Statistics Office, and that still goes through a cleaning process and a harmonization process to ensure representativeness. And in some countries, it becomes particularly challenging when we get to the state level, that certain states are not as representative as others. And there are some statistical techniques that can be applied, and then there are some scenarios where that is no longer feasible, and we need to think a little bit more creatively about what the inputs are or how to fill some of those data gaps. So I don't come in with like a straight answer, but that there are some other data sources that we can use to verify some of the more bespoke data collection, like Ushahidi is crowdsourcing, and even the gold standard data sets, have to be examined a little bit further before launching into really these high resolution, really targeted heat maps, so that the use of the data is also sensitive.
Melissa, thank you. I'm going to ask a question. This comes again, I'm sort of picking up across several. So thank you, colleagues who are putting questions in the Q&A. Initially to Emmanuel and Harsh, and then we can open up to the others. And as I do this, I'm also sharing the moderation role with my colleague Corrado from the Crisis Bureau, an expert in this area as well too. So he will pick up the transition seamlessly from here. But let me put this question forward, Emmanuel. Some of the work that you do, and you emphasize this in your talking points, is around institutional connectivity. And all of you have brought up this necessity of collaboration, but also understanding across very different actors, development, humanitarian, data scientists, ethicists, and that's important and not easy. So my questions, Emmanuel, for you is, where have you seen this work effectively? Where have you seen, or where is there work that you could share with us on learning and knowledge exchange that is facilitating and building that collaboration, which I think is so essential? And I think for Declan and Melissa, it'd be great to have the reflection from your side as well too. And where does this hit the road with communities, with decision makers, et cetera, in real life? So Emmanuel, if I can pose that to you first.
Sure. Okay. So I'll try in less than a minute. So first, we talked about biases first, and it's not just statistical biases. It's a well-known fact that all data sources are biased. They have a statistical bias, and there are ways to correct for it. And so with people like Emilio Zagheni, for example, we've been working for almost 10 years on correcting for sample biases, including in big data, where people say, well, big data is biased, etc. Well, yes, of course it's biased, and the Earth is round. Like, of course it's biased, and so there are ways to correct that. But it's important to know that it's biased. But even official statistics are biased. And they're also a representation of reality that we, like, what is GDP? It's an invention, so it's biased. Like, so all data is biased. But I think the biases we talked about are also the political biases, and so it's the digital divide in other ways. So it's more like the imbalance, so to speak. And so yes, institutional connectivity. So it's the way we try to address that is through, and it sounds like something you have to say if you work in development, but is really with working. So in the countries where we have projects, so we have teams in the countries where we have projects, and we work with so national partners, national as in governmental partners, National Statistical Office in particular, civil society organizations, so activist groups, also academics a lot, also the private sector. So it's a bit like the laundry list of your typical proposal stakeholders, but like in practice. So in a case like gender-based violence in Mexico, for example, and it's a very good case of like, we don't want to build resilience there. Like, we don't want like women to be more resilient to gender-based violence. We want gender-based violence to decrease or just stop. And so that's a very long like cultural like road, and so you need little pieces of understand, etc. But so you and to do that, so you need to work with all those people. So it needs to be like built in the DNA of the organization. It takes time. It's challenging. It takes more time, I think, usually than it would be, for instance, to write a paper or to develop a nice visualization platform and say, oh, here's our fancy dashboard, etc. But usually those dashboards like don't achieve anything but making the people who build them happy about themselves. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh, but I think we need to think about the theory of change. And confront ourselves to the real reasons why there are things in the world that are not the way they should be, and what data exactly, what kinds of role data can play in the fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel, and hello everyone. This is Corrado taking over from Laurel. Melissa, did you want to address this question too?
Yeah, I had one point, and I think, it's just to pull the thread on Emmanuel's statement. For the way we think about it is like, if data and these types of new techniques can fit into workflow and how you are currently working, it moves to action much faster. So in our COVID response work, most recently, our vulnerability maps and data sets on specific issues like mapping populations and communities with high concentrations of comorbidities, where there'd be complications to COVID. These were really high risk areas. They fit very well into microplanning, which is a system that already exists, that health workers are familiar with, that district planners are familiar with. And that was kind of the fastest uptake I've ever seen of the data going into decision making and being on the ground at the local level to start. So it was funded at the top, and we were able to connect through partners down to the day-to-day users of the data very quickly. And I think that for me is the biggest obstacle to operationalization of the data, but is the greatest opportunity. And in some of the faster moving environments, I think there's a lot to be said for the work that's being done now to have a wealth of information at our fingertips for when it's needed, and taking the time now to understand workflow decision making for our stakeholders, so that when the time comes, it's a kind of quick switch to turn on and operationalize this information.
Thanks, Melissa. Declan, do you want to address this question? And if you don't mind, Declan, I'll throw in there, in the interest of time, a last question that was posed by a colleague, which is about data quality, and how do you ensure that, and how do you avoid the garbage in, garbage out syndrome? So Declan, over to you, if you don't mind, for these two last questions before we wrap up, and then to Harsh. Thanks.
All right, I'll try to be really quick. There's a saying that we have, Heidi, that technology is only 10% of the solution. We don't go into anything believing that technology is what will solve it. There's so many other things that have to go into creating a solution that actually works on the ground. But having said that, it's still a critical piece. It will help you to identify the places maybe where you need to lay your emphasis, or to easily highlight where the issues are that can then be targeted. So it doesn't exist in a silo. It has to exist in an ecosystem of actors all working towards a common good. But then it's one of the tools that we can use in that sense. And on data quality, again, there's various ways that we can do this. A lot of it in the design of the solutions that folks are coming up with. This is something that is very context dependent. And not only quality, but some of the challenges that we are facing now are extremely large volumes of data. Like there's a fire hose of data coming out that is just too difficult to handle, to process. So we're having to be a lot more deliberate in what we're choosing to look at, to narrow down our focus into something that is manageable, where we can ensure the data quality standards, whatever it is that we're reporting, is something that we can back up. And this is, again, the same that we encourage our deployers and so on. So there's a few things that we can do to help with that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Declan. Harsh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to reflect briefly on the conversation, I kind of echo the other panelists in talking about the importance of the politics and getting the politics of data right. I think this is where data collaboratives can also help at different levels. I don't want to be naive about them, but I think that there are good examples where data collaboratives in the health or in the gender sector can mobilize the right actors to have conversations, to be in the same room, and to really put national data systems at the center. In the OECD perspective, I think there's an opportunity for donors to be more vocal in facilitating these types of data collaboratives. And I think you're seeing some examples of this from institutions like the Millennium Challenge Corporation or the EU institutions, but there's certainly more that could be done. On data quality, I think this is a great question, but I think the answer is just, it's important to really roll up our sleeves and do the due diligence, and that means reading the metadata, looking at credible institutions, talking to them, and really sifting through the specifics of the data to ensure that we are capturing the right information at the right time. And of course, this isn't easy. It's much easier said than done. But I would also say that it's important in the long term to look at the data, learn from some of the lessons when it comes to data gaps, and then invest in national data systems, because that's how you can systematize and regularize the production of such data, so that it's not so one-off, and so that it's actually sustainable for different sets of actors working in these countries. So I would say that's one way to work towards data quality, both in the short and long term. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Harsh. I'll give Emmanuel an opportunity to react on the data quality question, then Melissa, and then we will wrap up.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Eduardo. So just a few words. So I think rather than quality, I would stress the importance of relevance of data, by which I mean like all the discussions we talked about the role of measurement. I mean, the title of the event is like measuring, improving, like, repeat. So it's sort of like, machine learning applied to sort of like, human systems. And so, but for that, you need relevant data. You need also like relevant like objectives. And so, yeah, the question is like, yeah, what is the relevant indicator? What is the relevant and then the relevant goal that you're trying to optimize or reach? One framework in closing that I find useful is to kind of, and I think that Declan, I think he's the one who used the analogy of like food and land, etc., which I liked. So many years ago, I wrote a small blog post calling "The Data Revolution is about knowledge security." Or should be about knowledge security, and I use an analogy of the FAO food security framework applied to data. So where it's about the availability of good data, the accessibility to good data, the usability, so you get into things like data literacy, for example, and then the predictability. So the predictability of data, especially private sector data, like for how long and how are we as human societies and national statistical systems going to be able to use those data? So I think that's to be my closing statement. I quite like this analogy between food security and knowledge security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and I think it's a great way to wrap up the panel. So thank you very much for joining, Emmanuel, Harsh, Melissa, Declan. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise. Really glad to have had the opportunity to have you as part of this development dialogue series. Thank you for all to all who attended. I encourage you to look at the upcoming sessions of development dialogues. For us, it was very useful. I'll just end up mentioning that in UNDP, we're of course investing in the topic of data and fragility with our recent data strategy. So we look forward to being in touch with you and to improving our work on this aspect. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.